The sirens were blaring across the border checkpoint as 300 of our freight trucks were instantly impounded by federal agents. My phone vibrated with 80 missed calls from the new VP. I just took a sip of my coffee. Backing up 15 years, let me tell you how it all started. I'm Richard Vance, 52 years old, and until recently, I was the director of cross-border operations for Thorne Logistics. We were an absolute titan in the supply chain sector, moving over $200 million worth of commercial freight, raw industrial materials, and high-risk hazardous cargo across the southern border every single year. My job was the nerve center of the entire enterprise. When you are dealing with hazmat manifests, double axle weight regulations, and the relentless scrutiny of customs and border protection, there is absolutely zero margin for error. Thorne Logistics was built from the ground up by Elias Thorne. Elias was a grizzled, old-school freight veteran who understood that in the logistics world, trust and compliance were your actual currencies. When I joined his company 15 years ago, we only had 30 trucks. We were barely scraping by, competing with mega carriers who had infinite resources. Elias brought me in because I knew the federal customs matrix better than anyone. I spent my 20s working directly alongside border compliance agencies, learning the exact intricacies of the CTPAT, the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. For those outside the industry, CTPAT is essentially a VIP fast pass for freight. If you have it, your trucks cross the border in minutes. If you don't, your trailers get unpacked, inspected, and delayed for days, bleeding cash by the hour. Elias and I worked side to side for over a decade. I handled the government audits, the continuous transit bonds, and the hazmat security plans. We grew the fleet from 30 to 300 massive rigs. We secured contracts with the largest chemical battery manufacturers in the hemisphere. Our valuation skyrocketed. We were clearing $15 million in annual recurring revenue just from our specialized chemical transport division. We were unstoppable. But 7 years ago, we hit a massive administrative roadblock. During a complex corporate restructuring to separate our assets from a liability lawsuit involving a third-party subcontractor, the company temporarily lost its standing to hold the primary federal transit bond. We had 50 trucks loaded with lithium-ion batteries sitting at the border, burning thousands of dollars in late delivery penalties every single day. Elias was in a panic. He called me into his office at 2 a.m., pacing the floor, looking like he was about to have a heart attack. "Richard, we are bleeding dry. The lawyers are saying it will take 6 months to get the corporate entity recertified for the hazardous bond." "We don't have 6 months. We don't even have 6 days before we lose the primary contract," Elias said, his voice shaking. I had a solution, but it was incredibly unorthodox. I owned a small personal holding company, Vance Compliance LLC, which I had maintained strictly for independent consulting before I joined Thorne full-time. My LLC already had pristine federal standing and possessed the exact clearance tier required to hold a continuous customs bond for hazardous materials under 19 CFR Craft 114. "Elias," I said, sliding a stack of paperwork across his desk, "I can underwrite the transit bond through my personal LLC. I can lease my CDPAT certification to the fleet as a designated third-party compliance operator. The federal system allows it, provided I remain the named director of operations. But it means the federal government will view me, personally, as the guarantor of your entire cross-border fleet." He didn't even hesitate. He signed the operational transfer right then and there. From that night forward, Thorne Logistics operated its most profitable division entirely under the legal umbrella of Vance Compliance LLC. I held the keys to the kingdom. My name was on every manifest, every border pass, every hazardous transit permit. Over the years, the temporary fix just became the permanent foundation. The corporate lawyers forgot about it. The accounting department just saw it as a standard operational expense. We were making too much money for anyone to care about the structural anomaly. Everything was perfect until Elias had a severe stroke last year. He survived, but he was forced into immediate retirement. He handed the keys to his 29-year-old son, Julian Thorne. Julian was the exact opposite of his father. He had never driven a truck, never stood on a loading dock at 4 a.m., and never negotiated with a hostile customs agent. He went to a prestigious private business school, wore tailored Italian suits, and spoke entirely in corporate jargon. To him, the 300 drivers keeping the company alive were just numbers on a spreadsheet that needed to be optimized. When he took over as VP of Operations, the entire culture of the company shifted overnight. He brought in a team of fresh-faced consultants who knew nothing about freight, but everything about cutting corners to boost short-term profit margins. He didn't see me as the architect of his father's success. He saw me as an obsolete, overpaid fossil who didn't fit his sleek, modern corporate vision. And I was about to find out exactly how arrogant he could be. Julian wasted no time tearing down everything his father and I had built. Within his first 3 months, he slashed the maintenance budget for the fleet by 30%, replaced our veteran dispatchers with a cheap automated routing software that constantly crashed, and instituted a draconian penalty system for our drivers. Morale plummeted. We lost 20 of our best drivers in a single week. But because the overall payroll expenses dropped, Julian looked like a genius to the board of directors. He was parading around the office like he had single-handedly invented the concept of logistics. I tried to warn him. I walked into his glass-walled corner office on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a stack of delayed shipment reports. He was practicing his golf putt on an artificial turf mat, not even looking up when I entered. "Julian, we need to talk about the automated routing system," I said, dropping the reports on his pristine mahogany desk. "It's forcing the hazardous material trucks onto secondary highways that aren't cleared for chemical transport. We are risking massive federal fines. The drivers are exhausted, and the customs officers are starting to flag our manifests because the arrival times are erratic." Julian finally looked up, leaning on his putter with a condescending smirk. "Richard, you are missing the big picture. The software reduces idle fuel consumption by 12%. We are modernizing. You need to stop living in the past with my father's outdated methods." "Your father's methods ensured we didn't get our licenses revoked," I countered, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You can't optimize compliance. It is binary. You either follow the federal code or they shut you down. If a truck carrying industrial lithium batteries gets flagged on an unauthorized route, the EPA and customs will freeze the entire fleet." He rolled his eyes, tossing the putter aside and sitting down behind his desk. He intertwined his fingers, looking at me like I was a stubborn child. "Look, Richard, I appreciate what you did for my dad when this company was basically a mom-and-pop operation. But we are scaling. We are preparing for a massive acquisition deal next quarter. The buyers want to see streamlined operations, not a bloated payroll and a director of operations who thinks he is untouchable because he has been here for 15 years. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was building a case to terminate me. My salary and my annual bonuses were significant. If he could eliminate my position and distribute my responsibilities among 3 junior managers making entry-level wages, he could artificially inflate the quarterly earnings right before the acquisition. He thought I was just an expensive middle manager. He had absolutely no idea that the entire legal architecture of his cross-border fleet was resting entirely on my shoulders. The climax arrived on a rainy Thursday morning. I was in the middle of coordinating a massive, time-sensitive shipment of medical-grade batteries destined for a hospital network in Mexico. It was a $4 million contract that required absolute precision. My desk phone rang. It was Julian's assistant, coldly informing me that my presence was required in the executive conference room. Immediately, when I walked in, Julian was sitting at the head of the long table. Next to him was a ruthless, slick-haired corporate attorney named Vance. No relation to me, just a highly paid shark Julian had brought in to handle the restructuring. There was a single manila folder sitting on the table. "Take a seat, Richard," Julian said. He wasn't smirking anymore. He was trying to project an aura of absolute authority. I remained standing, crossing my arms. "I have trucks hitting the border in 20 minutes, Julian. Make this quick." The lawyer opened the folder. "Mr. Vance, as part of our ongoing operational restructuring, the company has decided to move in a different direction. Effective immediately, your position as Director of Cross-Border Operations is being eliminated. Your access to the corporate network has already been revoked. Security will escort you to your office to pack your personal belongings." I looked at Julian. He was leaning back in his expensive ergonomic chair, looking incredibly satisfied with himself. Eliminated? I asked, keeping my tone completely neutral. Who is going to manage the CTPAT audits? Who is handling the hazmat transit manifests? We have transitioned those administrative tasks to the new software system, overseen by my new logistics team, Julian replied smoothly. You're obsolete, Richard. The industry has moved past you. And the severance package? I asked. Knowing exactly what was coming, Julian chuckled, a dry, arrogant sound. Severance? Richard, you are being terminated for cause, specifically insubordination and failure to adapt to new corporate protocols. You've been hostile to the new management structure since day one. We owe you nothing. In fact, you should be thanking me that I'm not pursuing legal action for the revenue we lost due to your archaic methods. It was a blatant, calculated lie. They were firing me to save my $200,000 salary and my pending $4 million performance bonus. They wanted a clean balance sheet for their upcoming acquisition, and I was the biggest expense on the ledger. The lawyer pushed a piece of paper across the table. Sign this non-disclosure and non-compete agreement, and we will allow you to keep your company vehicle for another 30 days. Refuse, and security will walk you out right now. I looked at the document. Then I looked at Julian. He was practically vibrating with smug superiority. He thought he had completely outmaneuvered a veteran player. He thought he had won. I won't be signing anything, I said quietly. Julian's smirk widened. I thought you might say that. You're fired, Richard. Pack your desk. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't throw a tantrum or demand to speak to his father. I simply nodded, turned around, and walked out of the conference room. I went to my office, packed 15 years of my life into a single cardboard box, and walked out to my car. As I drove out of the corporate parking lot, I felt a strange sense of absolute calm. Julian thought he had just optimized his payroll. He didn't realize he had just pulled the pin on a federal grenade. I drove straight home, the afternoon sun beating down on the windshield. My phone was completely silent. They had already cut my access to the corporate email servers, the dispatch logs, and the driver communication network. I was completely locked out of Thorne Logistics. But that didn't matter. The only system that actually mattered wasn't hosted on their servers, it was hosted on mine. I walked into my home office, set my cardboard box on the floor, and booted up my personal, heavily encrypted workstation. I didn't need their corporate network. I needed the federal portal. I navigated to the secure login page for the U.S. Customs and Border Protection automated broker interface. I inserted my physical hardware security token, typed in my credentials, and watched the screen load. There it was, Vance Compliance LLC. Under my personal company's dashboard sat the active continuous transit bond and the primary CT-PATE certification that provided absolute clearance for 300 Thorne Logistics freight trucks. Every single vehicle identification number, every driver profile, and every hazardous material manifest was legally tethered to my LLC. According to the federal government, Thorne Logistics didn't have the authority to move a single lithium battery across the border. Vance Compliance LLC did. Thorne Logistics was just a designated subcarrier operating under my explicit, voluntary legal umbrella. Julian's new management team, his expensive lawyers, and his shiny automated routing software were all completely blind to this. During the due diligence for his upcoming corporate acquisition, they had only looked at the surface-level operational expenses. They saw that the customs fees were being paid. They never bothered to check whose name was actually on the federal guarantor documents. They just assumed it was a corporate asset. It was 4:30 p.m. on a Thursday. I poured myself a glass of aged bourbon, sat back in my leather chair, and went to work. Under 19 CFR 114, a principal bondholder has the absolute right to terminate a designated subcarrier's operating privileges at any time, for any reason, without prior notice, if they believe the subcarrier can no longer ensure the security of the hazardous cargo. By firing the only qualified compliance officer, me, Thorne Logistics was now officially operating unguided. I clicked on the Subcarrier Management tab. I selected the entire fleet profile for Thorne Logistics. 300 active trucks, $200 million in annual freight. I hit the Revoke Association button. The system prompted me for a secondary confirmation. Warning: Severing this association will immediately invalidate all active transit manifests and border crossing clearances for the selected subcarrier. Vehicles currently in transit may be subject to immediate impoundment. Proceed? I took a slow sip of my bourbon. I typed my digital signature. I clicked confirm. In less than 3 seconds, the federal database updated. The kill switch was activated. The CTPAT clearance was instantly dissolved. The continuous transit bond for hazardous materials was voided. Thorn Logistics was now a massive, heavily loaded freight company operating entirely without federal authorization. But I wasn't done. If I just left it at that, the trucks would simply get turned around at the border, causing a major delay, but perhaps something Julian could eventually untangle with enough expensive lawyers and a few weeks of downtime. I wanted maximum, catastrophic impact. I wanted the kind of chaos that makes the board of directors demand a resignation. I drafted a formal, legally bulletproof notification to the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Transportation. I informed them that as the primary guarantor, I had severed ties with Thorn Logistics due to critical management restructuring that compromises the secure transport of hazardous materials. I cited my own termination as the primary evidence that the company no longer possessed a qualified compliance officer on staff. When you tell the federal government that 300 trucks carrying volatile chemical batteries are currently rolling toward an international border without proper oversight or legal bonding, they do not send a polite email. They initiate a full-scale lockdown. They flag every single license plate, every driver ID, and every corporate tax number associated with the company. I hit send on the notification at 5 p.m. The federal bureaucracy would take the weekend to process the severity of the alert. The real impact wouldn't hit until the massive Monday morning freight surge. I closed my laptop, finished my drink, and went out to my backyard to grill a steak. For the first time in 15 years, I wasn't stressed about dispatch logs, driver fatigue, or customs audits. I slept like a baby that entire weekend. I spent Saturday fishing at the lake and Sunday catching up on reading. My phone remained blissfully silent. Julian was likely spending his weekend celebrating his newly optimized payroll and preparing his presentation for the corporate buyers. He had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath his feet had already collapsed. He was standing on thin air, just waiting for gravity to notice. Monday morning arrived. I woke up at my usual time, 5:30 a.m. out of pure habit. I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee, walked out to my front porch, and watched the sun come up. At exactly 6:45 a.m., the first wave of Thorn Logistics trucks would be hitting the primary commercial inspection lanes at the southern border checkpoint. I checked my watch. 6:50 a.m. My phone, which had been silent for 3 days, suddenly lit up on the kitchen counter. It was an unknown number. I ignored it. 10 seconds later, it rang again, then again. Within 5 minutes, I had 12 missed calls. By 7:30 a.m., my inbox was flooded with urgent, high-priority automated alerts from the Thorn Logistics dispatch system, which they had apparently forgotten to fully disconnect from my secondary email address. The chaos had begun. The trap was fully sprung, and I had the best seat in the house. At 8 a.m., my phone vibrated with 80 missed calls from the new VP. I just took a sip of my coffee. The voicemails were stacking up, a beautiful symphony of escalating panic. I finally decided to listen to the first one. It was Julian's assistant, her voice trembling. "Richard, please, we need you to call us back immediately. There is a massive system glitch at the border. None of the trucks are clearing. Customs is demanding to speak with you." I deleted the message. It was the slick corporate lawyer Vance. He didn't sound arrogant anymore. He sounded breathless. "Mr. Vance, we have an emergency situation. The CTPAT system is showing our fleet as unauthorized. The Border Patrol is threatening to impound the vehicles. We need your login credentials to the customs portal. This is a direct order from the executive board." I laughed out loud. "A direct order?" I didn't work for them anymore. I deleted that message too. By 9 a.m., the situation had escalated from a delay to a full-blown federal incident. I turned on the local news channel. There was a helicopter shot of the southern border checkpoint. A massive, miles-long traffic jam of freight trucks was backing up onto the interstate. Right at the front of the line, clearly visible in high definition, were dozens of Thorn Logistics trailers. They weren't just being turned around, they were being actively cordoned off by armed federal agents. When a company attempts to cross an international border with hazardous materials without a valid continuous transit bond, the government treats it as a severe national security threat. The trucks are instantly seized. The drivers are detained for questioning, and the cargo is frozen in place until a massive penalty is paid and a new compliance officer is authorized. At 9:15 a.m., my phone rang again. This time, I recognized the number. It was Julian's direct cell line. I let it ring 4 times before I finally swiped to answer. "Hello?" I said, keeping my voice completely relaxed. "Richard, what the hell did you do?" Julian was screaming so loudly the audio was clipping. There was pure, unadulterated terror in his voice. "The entire fleet is seized. I have 300 trucks locked down. The Mexican hospital network is threatening to cancel the $4 million contract. The EPA is on line 2 demanding an explanation." "Julian, calm down," I said smoothly. "I don't know why you are calling me. As you stated very clearly on Thursday, my position was eliminated. I am no longer an employee of Thorn Logistics. I believe you said my methods were archaic and you owed me nothing." "Don't play games with me, Richard," he shrieked. "The federal agents are saying our hazmat bond is invalid. They are saying it's registered to Vance Compliance LLC. What is that? We own that, right? Give me the login right now, or I will sue you for everything you have." I took another sip of my coffee. "You might want to ask your expensive lawyer to actually read the corporate archives, Julian. Vance Compliance LLC is my personal company. I own it, 100%. 7 years ago, when your father nearly lost the entire TA fleet due to a legal technicality, I leased my personal federal bond to the company to keep it afloat. When you fired me, you fired the company's legal right to operate. I simply notified the government that I was no longer overseeing your highly questionable, corner-cutting operations." There was a dead, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear the gears in his head grinding to a halt as the reality of the situation crushed him. He hadn't just fired an employee, he had fired the legal foundation of his entire operation. You can't do that," Julian stammered, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "The acquisition, the buyers are arriving tomorrow for the final audit. If the fleet is impounded, the deal is dead. The company will go bankrupt in a month from the late delivery penalties alone." "That sounds like a significant management failure, Julian. You should probably consult your automated routing software for a solution. I'm sure it can optimize your bankruptcy filings." "Richard, please," he begged. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the pathetic whining of a boy who had broken his father's expensive toy. "How do we fix this? What do you want?" "I'll rehire you. I'll give you your salary back." "My salary, Julian. You fired me for cause, remember? You stripped my severance. You tried to steal my $4 million performance bonus to pad your quarterly stats. You don't have the authority to rehire me because I am never working for you again." "Then what do you want?" he screamed, on the verge of tears. "I don't want to talk to you, Julian," I said coldly. "I will only speak to the board of directors. Have them call me and tell them to bring their checkbook." I hung up the phone and blocked his number. Less than 20 minutes later, a sleek Blacktown car pulled into my driveway. The corporate attorney, Vance, stepped out, looking like he had aged 10 years over the weekend. He didn't have security with him. He didn't have Julian. He was clutching a thick leather briefcase, looking absolutely terrified. The shark had realized he was swimming in a pool of acid. I walked out to the porch, leaning against the wooden railing. "You have exactly 5 minutes, counselor. Make it count." The lawyer stood at the bottom of my porch steps, sweating through his expensive suit. He opened the briefcase with shaking hands. "Mr. Vance, Richard, the executive board is currently in an emergency session. The acquisition buyers have caught wind of the border shutdown and are threatening to pull their offer by noon. We are looking at a catastrophic loss of value. The board has authorized me to offer you a full reinstatement, your original salary, and a public apology from Julian Thorne." I looked at him with absolute disgust. "You clearly don't understand the leverage dynamic here. I don't want a job. I want what is legally mine, and I want compensation for the severe disruption to my personal company." "What are your terms?" the lawyer asked, his voice defeated. First, I said, ticking the demands off on my fingers. I want my full $4 million performance bonus wired into my account by 11 a.m. today, not next quarter. Today. Second, I want the standard severance package you tried to deny me. That is 12 months of my $200,000 salary, paid immediately. The lawyer scribbled frantically on a legal pad. Okay, 4.2 million. The board will authorize that to save the acquisition. If we pay this, you will reinstate the bond? I'm not finished, I interrupted, my voice turning to ice. Reinstating the bond on an emergency basis requires an exceptional amount of federal paperwork and personal liability assumption on my part. My consulting firm, Vance Compliance LLC, will charge an emergency reinstatement fee of $1 million. Non-negotiable. He swallowed hard. $5.2 million. Richard, the board will have to drain the emergency liquidity reserves to clear that amount in 3 hours. That sounds like a them problem, I replied. But there is one final condition, and this is the most important one. I stepped down the porch, looking directly into the lawyer's panicked eyes. I will not reinstate my federal bond to a company managed by Julian Thorne. He is a severe liability to my compliance record. Before I sign a single document, the board of directors must terminate Julian Thorne. For cause, severe operational negligence. He forfeits all his executive bonuses, he loses his management shares, and he is escorted out of the building by security, just like he did to me. The lawyer's eyes widened in sheer shock. You are asking the board to fire the founder's son. I'm giving the board a choice, I stated flatly. They can fire the founder's arrogant son, pay my fee, and save the $70 million acquisition deal. Or they can keep Julian, watch 300 trucks get permanently seized by the federal government, face millions in EPA fines, lose their biggest contracts, and file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy by Friday. You have 15 minutes to make a phone call. The lawyer practically sprinted back to his town car. He sat in the back seat, shouting frantically into his phone. 10 minutes later, he emerged, his face completely pale. He walked up to the porch, holding out a digital tablet. The board has agreed to all terms, he whispered. The wire transfers for $5.2 million have been initiated, and Julian was just terminated by a unanimous board vote. He is currently being escorted off the premises by building security. I took the tablet. I read through the legally binding settlement agreement. It was ironclad. They had capitulated entirely. I signed the document with a digital stylus and handed it back to him. Pleasure doing business with you, I said. I went back inside, booted up my laptop, and logged into the federal portal. I filed the emergency reinstatement paperwork, authorizing a temporary 30-day extension of the transit bond for Thorne Logistics. It was just enough time for the trucks to clear the border, for the company to finalize their acquisition, and for the new buyers to transition the fleet under their own compliance officers. By noon, the funds cleared my bank account. $5.2 million. I stared at the balance on my screen, letting out a long, slow breath. 15 years of hard work validated in a single morning. I heard through the industry grapevine that Julian did not take his termination well. He threw a massive tantrum in the lobby, screaming about how his father would ruin the board members. But his father was retired, and the board cared about one thing: the acquisition money. Julian was permanently blacklisted from the logistics sector. No reputable company would ever hire an executive whose negligence caused a massive federal border incident. He went from a smug, high-powered VP to a disgraced pariah in less than 4 days. As for me, I retired at 52. I bought a beautiful cabin on a lake in Montana, surrounded by pine trees and absolute silence. No dispatch calls, no customs audits, no arrogant Nepo babies trying to optimize my life. Just peace, quiet, and a very heavily padded bank account. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't plotting a complex scheme. Sometimes, it's just knowing your true value, letting an arrogant fool cut his own safety net, and watching gravity do the rest.